Then with that, I'd like to introduce our Director of Programs, Kathy Spansky. Kathy?
Hello, I'm not sure you're going to be able to hear me. My internet is not real good at the moment, so hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And I'm not frozen. Okay, well, today we are a pleasure to welcome Carolyn Miller, and she holds a BS in Botany and Plant Physiology from Michigan State University. And she is currently the plant recorder for MSU.
I did because I put the peppermint on, and
Would you turn mute?
He was going-
Someone, please mute. Before taking her position at MSU, Carolyn was a curator of plant collections at the Naples Botanical Gardens, where she took a keen interest in native landscapes. After returning to Michigan, she began a quest to landscape with native plants. Through trial and error, she now knows what works in her urban Lansing yard. Currently, she is president of the Wildflower Association of Michigan, recording secretary for the Michigan Botanical Club, and a master's degree student at Miami University of Ohio. In her free time, she and her wife, Diane, enjoy birding, botanizing, camping, cooking, and hanging out with their cat. Now her presentation today, a little bit about that. For those living in an urban setting, it may be difficult to landscape with native plants. Many of those plants seem to have the word weed in their name, such as swamp milkweed, butterfly weed, ironweed. 4 years ago, we purchased an urban home in Lansing, and the first thing we did was eliminate all the turf grass. Wow. Next, we worked to determine what plants work and what plants do not work. You might wonder, how do I aesthetically landscape my yard? Plant placement is the key in an urban environment. And she's going to tell us all about that and how we might be able to do that. Welcome, Carolyn. And before she starts, please, everybody mute. And also turn your camera off. We don't want to see any people's faces on the side, okay? All right, thank you, everybody, and welcome, Carol.
Thank you so much. I really hope that we could meet in person, as it's so much more engaging, but I'll do the best we can using our Zoom platform. As mentioned before, I am the plant recorder for Michigan State University. We have 5,000 acre campus, and we have over 20,000 trees and anywhere from, I'm just going to ballpark it, but in excess of 50,000 shrubs on campus. So yes, I know where they are all located. And I do a lot of and I do that through GPS and GIS work. But you could say I'm a real tree hugger, and I love what I do. But so getting started, landscaping with native plants can be tough. I have had a lot of trial and error on this, but I love doing it. And we actually have a very small yard, so eliminating all the turf grass wasn't so bad. But I just, I didn't want to mow a lawn, knowing that turf grass just doesn't offer anything to native insects, to birds, to some mammals. So I really wanted to change that. And I will say, I really wanted to change that urban environment. And I will say, I had to do this aesthetically. And again, trial and error, I have figured it out, but I'm always constantly adding and subtracting. I figure out who's not doing so well and who's a little aggressive, so I yank them out. But we're gonna get started. Oh, and I should say, so in the picture, that is me holding a nutria, which is a member of the rodent family that's actually an invasive mammal down in the swamp areas of Louisiana, Mississippi, and we have a friend. This is his pet that he uses for educational purposes, and he's in Louisiana. So the nutria's name is Beignet, and I was so excited to hold this thing, but again, it's an invasive mammal. But here we go. Hopefully it switches. Yep, hang on here. Come on. Let's move forward. There we go. Okay, so what is a native plant? So these are plants that existed on the North American continent before the European settlers came in. And they have adapted to physical conditions and co-evolved with other species in the area. And the biggest example is the milkweed and the monarch. Milkweed, the monarch looks for milkweed plants to lay their eggs on because that is the only plant that the larvae will feed on. They ingest that liquid sap that makes them taste bad, and it's, birds might try to eat it once and then they spit it back out. But so in the co-evolved, so coevolution is just defined, it refers to the evolution of at least two species, which occurs in a mutually dependent manner. So the monarch feeds on the milkweed. The milkweed doesn't, the milkweed offers those alkaloids to protect the monarch from being eaten all the time. And there's so many more other insects, butterflies, bees that are, they're so specific to what plant they need, that they co-evolved with. It's actually quite fascinating. So why native plants? They're low input landscapes. You don't need to put down fertilizer or herbicide. They conserve water because once they're established, there's no need to water anymore. They can reduce global climate change by sequestering carbon, which through an extensive root system. There's a lot of studies that have been done with panicum grass, which is Panicum virgatum or switchgrass, and the amount of carbon that is stored in those roots can help sequester carbon that is being pushed into our atmosphere. They're absolutely beautiful and colorful plants, and they preserve biodiversity, which we are losing at quite a quick rate around the world, in fact. And also they support pollinators and songbirds. So I don't have a lot of shrubs in my yard because it's so small, and shrubs can get bigger. But if I had the room, I would definitely put shrubs in that would help our songbirds, because I'm a birder at heart as well. So when you look at native landscaping, you have to think of, well, what is my goal to do that? And is it beautification? Is it to increase biodiversity? Is it to control stormwater runoff? You could create a rain garden, which I actually did in our front yard, and it keeps your water, we've all seen these unexpected pop-up storms that there's just a deluge of water that's come down and floods areas. I can think of downtown Detroit. We've had quite a bit of flooding here in the Lansing area in Ingham County, but rainwater gardens can help prevent, it's a small portion, but it helps to keep that water on site and not running down the street into the drainage system and being dumped into a river that then potentially pollutes a river. No grass to mow. That was part of the reason why I re-landscaped our yard, and also to connect with nature. That's a big component. I spent, with the pandemic, excuse me, I spent quite a bit of time in my yard, just watching the pollinators that are coming in. And for me, it's satisfying. And, I'm a nature nerd, and this has been one of my greatest enjoyments is to put these flowering native plants in and watching all the insects and everything else that shows up. So, landscape consideration when you decide to do this. There's a bunch of things to kind of check off. So, plant height. seasonal dieback. Maybe you need having a foundation to draw your eye upon in that area. It could be a tree, it could be a large rock, it could be a sculpture piece, something very simple. It could be a shrub that is, that's gorgeous. And then you just put that, it adds a little height difference in your yard. And also maintenance, because that could be kind of key, but also what habitat are you trying to mimic? So that comes down to do your research. If you're in the shade, if you're in the sun, do you have kind of a wet property? Then is it rain or shade in that wet property? So two big things to actually look into is you can look at the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. And in there, they'll have different plant zones and different zones based on soil type. So, and they'll list species that should be found in that area, which kind of makes it fun so that you can look and see, all right, this is where I'm located. This is what I think was in this area. And then you can go from there in planting. Also, a field guide to the natural communities of Michigan. That goes right along hand in hand with Michigan Natural Features Inventory as well. It's a great book. It's even a great book if you're interested in other ecosystems in the state of Michigan. And I use this all the time so I can go find interesting plants. I'm a photographer at heart, and this allows us to kind of get out and I can look at an area we're going to and figure out, all right, what should be here and where can I potentially find that? So what to consider in your yard? Your soil type. That's very, very important. Is it clay? Is it sand? Is it a loam mix? Loam is typically a combination of clay and sand in different percentages. Is it sunny? So you have to look at the sun factor. Is it full shade, part sun, full shade? The key to that is watch the area. I'm in almost completely full sun. We didn't have any trees on our property. So I put a few native trees in. I put a redbud in, and I also put a musclewood tree in as well. That was actually the only native plant that I could plant in I always call it the hell strip, which is between the sidewalk and the street. And it was the only native plant that I could put in, as there were a number of other non-native species, but I really wanted a native tree. So that's what I put in, and I'll tell you why later. Soil moisture, is it dry? Is it have a medium, is it a medium moisture, medium dry, or is it completely wet? Also root structure, taproot plants, fibrous plants, and rhizomatous plants. If we look at soil moisture as an example, it's the right plant for the right place. And again, research is key. As I said, watch the soil drainage, see how quickly the water percolates. Also the sun, how much sun is that area getting? And it is, as an example, lupin, it prefers it dry. It does not like wet feet. And I have wanted to grow lupin so badly in my little urban yard. However, I have very rich soil that tends to kind of hold the moisture a bit. And I have tried 3 times to try to plant lupin, and it doesn't like it. It rots out pretty quick, never blooms. So as much as I love it, I had to give up. Cardinal flower, on the other hand, prefers it damp, and also it prefers it sunny. That plant has done extremely well in my yard. And a lot of this, so then we'll move on to root structure. I love this slide as it shows some of the root structure of these plants. So I'm hoping it's on the left on your screen, but that's Kentucky bluegrass. That's turfgrass. The root structure only goes down not even an inch. So It doesn't absorb any water. It doesn't break the soil apart as it goes down farther. And then as you look to the right of that Kentucky bluegrass, you see all the root structures and how deep they go. And if you look at compass plant alone, it goes down almost 15 feet, which is good because it breaks the soil apart and it allows for that water that when we're getting these large rain events to percolate down into the soil and stay on site versus running off. Big blue stem is another, that's a grass. Same thing. I think I've seen that has gone down as deep as 10 plus feet. And again, and then with the root structure, especially these fibrous roots, we talked about carbon sequestering. These are why this happens. It pulls so much of that carbon in, and it helps a little bit with the climate change, but it is pulling carbon in, and it is working. So let's look at the different types of roots, different types of root structures. So fibrous root systems, which are actually my favorites. And we talked about big blue stem, compass plant, which that's the compass plant that is on there. Fibrous roots, they'll go, they go down deep. And if you need to remove one of those plants, it's a lot easier to do versus taproot systems, which as a classic taproot system is Asclepias cercea, which is the common milkweed. I love common milkweed, but I won't put it in on small scale. It can also run a bit, which we'll talk about that next. And it has this, but this is a classic taproot plant. It goes straight down. It doesn't have a lot of fibrous root systems, but this is a taproot. This is an example of a taproot. And these are the ones you kind of have to watch out for. These are rhizomatous root systems, also known as the runners. Canada anemone. So they horizontally run. And I have a few clients in the part of my fun, I guess you could say, side job is I'm trying to promote more native plantings in urban landscapes. And I get calls, I get emails to please come look at people's yards, see what we, see how we can transform all of it or just a small portion of it with native plants. If it's a large area, I will put Canada anemone in. If it's a small urban area, I won't put that in because it tends to run. Canada goldenrod, this is also another plant that tends to run. So I won't put those in because of that factor. If you try to remove some of these, it can be relatively difficult because of the fact that these runners, they're horizontal stems. One chunk that you miss, that one develops into another plant, and then you're back to square one again. So just as a caution, be careful of those rhizomatous plants. And green coneflower, Rudbeckia lacinatia, that's not a good one either. It tends to run. I can't tell you how many people ask me, oh, I've got plenty of green coneflower. Anybody want any? Can't plant it, especially in my yard. It would take over everything. So in urban settings, I'm very picky at what goes into the landscape. You can say there might be on the invasive side a bit. However, they're not an invasive plant, but they're a little bit too vigorous. And so my suggestion is that stick with tap and fibrous root plants, especially the fibrous roots. They do much better. I like them more. They have those larger root mass systems that can hold the water, break up the soil. That's what's important. So let's begin to look at planting. You can have placed planting and wild planting. So wild planting, if you live in the city, you may not want that that wild look. You might get the city to cite you on these. So therefore, it's a, therefore place planting in an urban environment is a much better solution. I love wild plantings, but only if you have that room to do that. That's something you could do in your backyard. I've kind of heard the thing where in urban settings, your front yard should be neat and clean, and in the backyard, it's a party. And that holds true, but I wanted native plants in the front yard, but I had to strategically place them. And that's where my little specialties come in, especially in an urban setting, is the placement of plant material. So, remember, if you live in a city, you may not want to have that wild look. So let's look at shaded areas. And again, really watch what your yard is doing. If you have picked out an area in your yard, watch that area across the 24-hour period. Of course, you've got your nighttime, but watch it during the day. What gives it shade? Is it a tree? Is it an arbor? Maybe it's another house. So always take a day and watch for that morning sun, afternoon sun, because that's going to be key. You're not going to want to put something that, there may be a plant that you think, oh, this will be great, but it loves the shade, and you're putting it in full sun. It won't do well. Chances are it's just going to fry itself out. And therefore, taking the time to look at that area, that will help you determine what plant material can go in. So let's look at what can be planted in a shade area. So this is from I'm involved in the Wildflower Association of Michigan, and this is an area that he wound up removing from his property. So the tree is a pin oak, which is sitting there, which is Quercus palustris, and a native tree. And 20 years ago, he removed everything that was underneath that tree and replaced it with spring ephemerals and shade-loving natives. So spring ephemerals are extremely important because they bloom early, and bumblebee queens, so it's the queen bee of the bumblebee, she overnests. And when she emerges early in the spring, excuse me, she's hungry. So spring ephemerals are some of the first plants to come up and bloom. And those bumblebee queens, as they emerge, they're finding that food source. So some of the plants in here are, you can kind of see the white ones on the one side. We've got red baneberry, which is the white puffy flower. And there's also Trillium grandiflorum, commonly called giant trillium, and also woodland phlox, which is Phlox divaricata. And that one is a tubular flower. So you'll start to get some of those early emerging butterflies either coming out of their chrysalis form, or some butterflies actually, excuse me, some butterflies actually overwinter. They're kind of said to have like a glycol, which is an antifreeze property inside them, so they don't freeze. And on a warm sunny day, some of those guys, they'll emerge because they've warmed up, and they're definitely seeking flowers to get a nectar source for energy. So our mid to late summer flowers, we have a couple of goldenrods that do very well in the shade, and that's blue-stemmed goldenrod, which is Solidago cassia, and zigzag goldenrod, which is Solidago flexicalis. And I think the one in the picture is, I think that's flexicalis. So actually the stem kind of zigzags a little bit. And so now we're going to look at some of the other species that were also planted in this little area. As I mentioned, red baneberry, Virginia bluebells, which is Mertensia virginica. This one blooms very early in the spring, and it's wonderful to see the queen bumblebees hitting that plant. They're full of pollen. There's nectar in there to draw the bumblebee in, and she's getting pollen for her brood and also nectar for as an energy source. White trillium, same thing. I've watched big queen bumblebees hit the trillium to gather the pollen. Maidenhair fern, that's really used as a you can use that as a ground cover. That will be, it'll be green throughout the entire year. Here's blue stem goldenrod. Actually, it does have somewhat of a blue stem, which is why it's called that. Other plants that can be planted in the shade, blue lobelia, Lobelia syphilitica. It likes it a little more on the damp side. So if you have an area that is a little bit on the damp side, this one does very well. It also works well in a rain garden. As I mentioned before, I have a rain garden and my blue lobelia is in full sun. I'll tell you what, this year, I've never had, the plants were so robust. The bees were all over them. I had hummingbirds coming in. This is a great hummingbird plant as well. Columbine, shade lover, has those hanging. You can just sort of see the hanging anthers in that flower. Queen bees, the queen bumblebee, they hit it, as well as I had other small pollinator bees hit that as well. The woodland phlox, starry Solomon seal, these are all great plants for shade. Like I mentioned, most of my yard is full sun, except for what's underneath the redbud tree. So a few of these I've been able to put in, not a lot of them because it just doesn't quite stay shady enough. And they have a tendency to burn out pretty quick because of that. It's the intense sun, the front yard is facing south. So it gets sun all day long. So I have to be kind of careful with these guys. I love them, but again, it's too sunny. So my fun has been really with the sunny plants. Sand coreopsis blooms early summer, and it was just a magnet for pollinators. And I'll stress that it was trial and error with a lot of these plants because I just wanted to put in lots of plants without really thinking about it. So I've had to remove things, add other plants, but sand coreopsis is it's a shorter bloomer, and it's just a bright sea of yellow and excellent pollinator plant. Cardinal flower, I have had, this one sits in my rain garden, does very, very well in the rain garden, was a profuse bloomer this year. Hummingbirds love it because, hummingbirds are attracted to the red flower. And I had, this year we didn't have as many hummingbirds. In the past, I've had a few more hummingbirds, but those are the key, I haven't seen a whole lot of bumblebee action on the cardinal flower, or I'm just missing it. I know that there's been butterfly action because of that tubular flower. They prefer that. The penstemon, this is Penstemon digitalis, this is one of the taller penstemons. This one, I had all different species of bees hitting this one in particular. Here are some other ones that are in the front yard. Swamp milkweed, that one is sitting in the rain garden area. This is Asclepias incarnata with it's one of the native wasps that's sitting on that one. Purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea. That one, it's actually an American painted lady on this one. So the swamp milkweed and the blue lobelia prefer a little bit wetter. They don't like it too dry. So if there's a depression somewhere, this plant does very well. Yellow coneflower, Retivita, pineta, that one absolutely, it's, once that one gets going, the smaller pollinators are all over that one, especially the sweat bees and the metallic bees. They are all over that. I'm actually going to stop just for a second. And Beth, do we have any questions?
Actually, we forgot to mention, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. And we can take periodic stops and ask. Is there anybody who wants to unmute themselves to ask a question at this point? Because I do have everybody muted.
Yes, I would like to, if I may.
Please.
The blue lobelia, you mentioned that that was good for planting in shade garden, but now you're also suggesting it for a sunny garden. So is it diverse where it could be planted both locations?
Yes. So I do see it in I've had it in shade, but if it's in shade, it definitely needs it on the damp side.
Okay.
And I just decided to try it in the sunny area. And it's in a rain garden that I created, and it does very, very well in the rain garden as well in full sun. So some of these can, this is one of those plants that could be part shade, part sun, and does very well in both. And I'm excited, I'm happy we have it. I'm also part of the Beale Botanical Garden on campus. And our blue lobelia is in a very damp area and nearly full shade. And it does wonderful. And then I have it in my sun garden, in my sunny rain garden, and it does absolutely perfect as well. So this is where you just have to, if something's listed as part shade, part sun, chances are it'll fill that spectrum of almost full sun, shade, full shade. But it needs to be on the damp side. That's the key to blue lobelia.
We do have a question in the chat. Kathleen asked, and I'm glad she did because that was my question, best place to purchase native plants?
We'll get to that at the end because I do have a few nurseries listed. And I know that there's so many more nurseries that are native plant nurseries that are really popping up throughout the state, but I will give you some ideas of where those nurseries are. So we'll get to that at the end.
Superb. Okay.
Good.
Onward.
Okay, here we go. So other plants that went in, turtlehead, which is Chelone glabra, and that one prefers, full, does well in full sun, and also prefers to, it needs to be on the damp side. This is typically one of those plants that you'll find where it's damp. And I shouldn't say that with the turtlehead, the flower is actually, it's on the tight side, and about the only bee to get in there is a bumblebee, because they are strong enough to pry the petals open and get inside. And people say, well, why would a bumblebee, why would a bumblebee even bother with this? So the plant offers lots of nectar, which, the bumblebee is looking for that as well, and plenty of pollen that coats the bumblebee. And she's also gathering it because only female bees do the work. The boys don't do any work at all. So it coats the bumblebee. She saves the pollen to take back to the nest, and she gets a reward of plenty of nectar. And she's the only strong enough bee to get in there. And also, bumblebees have a buzzing they have kind of a buzzing technology in them. They get in there, and I'm sure you've heard of squirrel corn and Dutchman's breeches. Well, in order for the pollen to be released, that female bumblebee, she buzzes her wings And it's a buzz pollination of those, of that flower. And so she gets in these turtle heads, and that's not kind of the same scenario. She does a little buzzing and the pollen is released for her to take it out. I also have southern blue flag, does so well in sunny conditions, likes it a little on the damp side. But again, it's in my rain garden and it doesn't rain every day. So it does well when it dries up and it does perfect when it rains. Another plant that prefers it on the dry side, dry and sunny, are pussy toes, which is Antonaria neglecta. And this actually is a great ground cover in sunny areas. And later in my presentation, I will really mention why I have put this in. Besides for ground cover, there's other reasons why. Other plants that I have put in were New England aster, rough blazing star, marsh blazing star, prairie smoke, and Rydell's goldenrod. Prairie smoke, again, is another perfect plant example for a ground cover. It's only, the foliage is only maybe tops out at 8 inches, but it's the flower. This is actually the seed head. That's why it's called prairie smoke. It is gorgeous. The flower, on the other hand, is really inconspicuous, but this is one of these plants that blooms early, and bumblebee queens find it because it's an early bloomer and it's buzz pollinated. So the queen bee needs to get up inside that flower that hangs over. I don't know if I can kind of point. So hopefully you can see, I don't know if you can see that, probably not, but I'm trying to point to kind of the flower, but it droops down, opens up, small opening, but that queen bumblebee can pries that flower open, gets up in there, does a little buzzing with the wings, releases the pollen. She collects the pollen, and also pollen coats her. So as she goes to the next flower, pollination occurs. Rydell's goldenrod. So all the goldenrods, especially Canada goldenrod, which is what now if you drive down the highway, that's the one you see. And everybody associates goldenrods with hay fever because that's what you see. However, all goldenrods are insect pollinated. That means the pollen stays on the plant until that insect, be it a bee, a butterfly, a beetle, comes along and wriggles around on those flowers to collect the pollen. What's blooming at the same time is ragweed. You don't see the ragweed. It's small, it's very short. It's typically it's more of an understory plant, to tell you the truth. Maybe gets 6 to 12 inches, but you really don't see it. You don't see the flowers on that. But this plant is loaded with pollen that is wind dispersed. So the winds come along, it blows that pollen all over the place, and that is what causes hay fever. So it's never a goldenrod. So now if somebody says, oh, that yellow flower, I have such bad hay fever, you all can say, nope, it's not that, it is ragweed. The other important thing about goldenrods is that they are late bloomers. There's a few that bloom early because there is actually an early goldenrod species, but most of goldenrods bloom late summer into the fall until the frost hits almost. And this is such an important source of nectar and pollen for bees, especially some of these queen bees. And the worker bees will take that back to the nest, and they use that to make their little brood chambers, because pollen is such a high source of carbohydrates and fat, and solidago is one of the best plants you can put in regards to the importance of late blooming plants. Other plants that I have put in, prairie dock, which is Silphium terebinthaceum. and also compass plant, which is another Silphium species, Silphium lancing, sometimes I butcher my names, lancinatum. So both of those have deep fibrous root structures. Compass plant, I love this leaf structure. Compass plant is named compass plant because it's said that the leaves will actually orient to full sun. So wherever you are, that leaf wants to get full, it will actually rotate the leaf to get full exposure of sunlight. Now, these two plants, so especially prairie dock, the leaves are huge. They're big. They can be, maybe 12 inches long, 12 inches wide. But in regards to the height, maybe tops out at 15 inches tall. It's the flower stalk that can go up 9 feet. And I love this plant. A, it gives incredible structure. And B, people always ask, what are those big leaves? Now, I have this place towards the back of my yard because, it is a big plant. But again, it's the tallness of that flower stalk that is the tallest point of the plant. But yet the leaf structure is hands down so cool. The bees love silphiums. They're always all over it. And also compass plant. Compass plant, almost the same scenario. Lots of basal leaves that maybe only get 15 to 20 inches tall, but has a stalk, doesn't go up as high as prairie dock, but definitely gets up about 6 to 8 feet tall. And another great bloomer, and the bees absolutely love it. Culver's root, that is on the edge and inside a rain garden. Again, it's, smaller flowers for smaller bees. This one had small little ground bees that were all over it. So lots of native bees definitely hit this, full of pollen. Absolutely, it's wonderful and has done very well, sometimes too well. So I have to weed out a lot of seedlings for the following year, but absolutely, it's a lovely plant. I get asked a lot, so now you have all these plants, should you mulch or use a ground cover of plant material? So if you do a ground cover, you could consider that a green mulch. So what is a green mulch? It's just vegetation that covers most of the ground so that you don't need to put that mulch down. With mulch, you are removing spaces of ground nesting bees. So when I talk about ground nesting bees, I'm not talking about those horrible yellow jackets. It's not those. They're solid. Most of them are solitary bees. They dig little tunnels, and having bare ground or a green ground cover, because they can still get down in there and create their little tunnels. That's where their brood nests are. And they make they make these little tunnels. They have little channels where they lay their eggs. They're either hauling in caterpillars for a food source for the developing egg, but they need some open spaces. Plants that are wonderful for a green ground cover, prairie smoke, which I mentioned, nodding onion, which is the picture there. That one also does. That's also a nice ground cover, but it also allows those little spaces for these ground tunnel bees or mason bees tend to like, they want to be up, they're typically up from the soil, but these little ground bees, they need those open spaces. Pussy toes, that was that Antinarian neglecta that I had an image of earlier. Wild strawberries, they spread by runners. They can be they're not bad, but in a small area, I usually won't put in wild strawberry because it can get a little aggressive. Ivory sedge and pen sedge do very well in sunny areas, and also pen sedge does fabulous in shady areas. I have, and if you read about Pennsylvania sedge, it says, oh, it's perfect for sun, it's better for your shade areas. However, I have clients, and including myself, that have it in full sun, and it does very, very well. And it spreads by a little runner, but it keeps popping up, and it's filling in where the more they fill in, the less weeding one has to do. So that's why, you can put these little ground covers in, and they'll slowly spread. None of these spread super fast, but it stops your weed, it stops the weed issue, and that's the big thing. So some really helpful hints. Asters, such as New England aster. This plant can get very tall. I have one New England aster that I planted, I'm going to say 15, 20 years ago at my parents'. It's on the south facing part of the house. About 10 years ago, that plant got to be, it was 8 feet tall. It's very happy. And then probably around, 4 or 5 years ago, somebody says, oh, well, you can cut those in half. And I didn't really think about it. So if you trim these asters in half, usually in June, kind of June-ish, early July at the latest, you will create a shorter, bushier plant. And it actually puts out more flowers, which is a good thing. But also, it's a New England aster especially is a late summer, early fall bloomer. And you put out, I cut them back every, usually late June. I get a much bushier plant and lots of flowers. So you can mulch if you wanted to mulch. I'm not against it, or you can green mulch. Plant clumping and not running plants, as I talked about earlier. Avoid, Rudbeckia laciniata, which is the green coneflower. Also, I typically will not put in common milkweed because it can get a little aggressive. So that's just one plant. I love it. I just can't put it in because of that fact. I would rather use swamp milkweed or butterfly weed. Another thing is always plant more than one individual. I've helped at numerous native plant sales, and I'll see people just grab one plant of some species, one plant of another species, and then I'll talk to them about the importance of having a few more individuals together. You're offering, because as I mentioned, some insects are specific. They only want a specific plant, a specific flower. If you put one of those in, it means that plant and that insect now has to go search for that same species elsewhere. And it uses up resources that they're trying to, it uses up energy. So therefore, putting them in, they always say 3 to 5s. That's typically what I do. And, plant them in groupings. So why should we landscape with native plants? Insect populations are declining. And as an example, when we were all younger, we could drive down the road in the evening with our headlights on, and our windshields would be covered with insects that hit the windshield. It's really hard to see that now. I'm not seeing, my windshields aren't covered as much as they used to be. So the insect populations are declining, and that has been researched and it is noted. We've got a painted, so I've kept track of species of insects that have come to my yard. And I can't stress enough, I am in a very urban environment. And every year I have watched new species of butterflies finding my yard. The butterfly on the left is a painted butterfly, and that is on a marsh blazing star. On the right is a bumblebee on bee balm, commonly otherwise known as Monarda fistulosa. And the painted butterfly is, its host plant is actually those pussy toes, that Antonaria neglecta species that I have. It's very close to the sidewalk that I have planted because it only gets maybe 3 inches tall, and that's pushing it. But it also it's also a great green mulch cover. So it's slowly spreading and filling up areas that it really inhibits weeds from coming in. And I'll tell you what, Beth, I'll stop again if there are more questions.
And there are, so thanks for asking. So let me scroll back up here. Marilyn asked, what attracts honeybees, the ones that are endangered?
So actually, honeybees are not endangered. And also, they are non-native. They tend to get the most press coverage because there's colony collapse that we are experiencing in honeybee hives. There are mites that attack the honeybee and they get into the hive, and mites typically bite into the honeybee, and as the honeybee's feeding, they're feeding those mites as well. So, and unfortunately, those guys are getting the most attention. And most commercial honeybees are actually shipped around the country. They haul them in, they dump them off. The almond fields in California, huge example. A lot of those honeybees, they're brought to those fields for the pollinating of the almond trees. When that is done, they're picked back up, and then they go down to Florida to pollinate citrus trees and other crops in Florida. So they're constantly moving. So honeybees are not threatened whatsoever. It's just that they're experiencing colony collapse. Our native bees are what's really important, and that's what we have to try to save. So think of the other bees as being good too, and not necessarily the honeybees. Next question.
All right, the next one, Mary Krieger asked, what's the scientific name of ivory sedge? But Mary Schwark already answered that, which is in the chat, which I'll butcher for you, is Carrick-eburnia.
Close enough, Eberna.
Was that good? Was that good? Tomato.
You did good.
Anita asked, what do you do about existing weeds or invasives to prep for planting? Also, what do you do about animals that eat the natives? I'm going to say that's probably a deer.
Yeah, I know. Oh, yes. So prepping.
So 2 questions there.
That sounds good. So prepping. When I did my yard, and again, I'm in an urban environment, there's a number of things you could do. I could have covered the lawn and smothered it for a year with maybe cardboard or newspaper, black tarp. For me, that would have been unsightly. So I'm actually I have my certification in pesticide, my pesticide license. And when I do client yards, I stress, I herbicide. I don't have the time to wait for it. And herbicide, when used properly, it's a tool. So I use it to remove turf grass, and also with invasive plants. With shrubs, I think autumn olive, buckthorn, honeysuckle. If you have those, we're actually coming up on the time that we can start taking care of them. in the fall, shrubs, trees, plants, it's all the same. They begin to suck down all the nutrition into that root system. So fall, and even in the winter, I have treated a number of invasive shrubs into the winter time because they're still pulling in no matter what. You cut them and then you treat them immediately with Roundup or glyphosate. That's how you do those. If, I'll mention this other one, if you have Japanese knotweed, don't cut it at all. Don't mow it, don't cut it. You trigger a response below ground that it realizes it's been severed, and it actually triggers a response in the root system to move horizontally and then pop back up again. So if you have Japanese knotweed, contact your conservation district, your local SISMA, which is with the conservation district, and SISMA is Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. Every county in the state of Michigan has a SISMA team, and you can report that you have that invasive, and they will help you take care of it. Other invasives, garlic mustard tends to be in shady areas. Just start plucking it. That's, it's about the only thing we can do. Most Roundup will affect, an herbicide will definitely help to take care of those invasives. Sometimes it depends on what the invasive is, because there might be a little bit different formula of the herbicide concentration that you need. So that's how that's how I take care of invasives. Anything else?
So we're going to go back to, what do you do about animals that eat the natives?
That's right.
Not just deer. I've been reminded bunnies, groundhogs, all those other little friends.
Oh, yes. Deer, there are actually plant lists out there that will tell you what native species are deer resistant, and two good resources is Wild Type Nursery, and that's a great nursery to obtain native plants. He's in Mason, Michigan, just south of Lansing. But he's got some publications that are listed on his website that actually, in fact, the species list, if you look under retail, he's got all the plant material that he grows, and it's noted whether or not it is deer resistant. So deer typically do not like mint, anything aromatic. So mints they'll leave it alone, and our nodding onion, they'll leave it alone because you break it, it smells like onion. They don't like that. They don't like rough texture. So the prairie dock and the compass plant has a very rough, hairy stem. They typically won't bother that either. Rabbits, on the other hand, they'll try anything. And it's, it's a crapshoot to what they'll touch and what they don't touch. Groundhogs, again, they'll eat everything. If you can trap groundhogs and move them in the country, that would be a suggestion. I have also used coyote urine. It comes in granular, and I have placed that around people's areas as well. So they groundhogs and rabbits, they're going to stay away, but that has to be reapplied. There's also liquid fence. Smells horrible, and again, it's that olfactory thing that deer won't touch it, rabbits won't touch it. Groundhogs, I don't know, not sure, but you could spray. But again, if it rains, then you have to reapply it. Anything else?
Sounds like you could use that with neighbors that you don't want either.
Don't get it on yourself.
We have 3 more questions from Lee. Lee asked, is Rydell's goldenrod an aggressive spreader?
It is not. So this is one of the things I've learned. With some of the goldenrods and even the asters, ironweed, love it. what other ones do I do? Even sand coreopsis. When things are done blooming, I cut the heads off so that they don't seed all over the place. And goldenrods, that's one of those things. As soon as the goldenrod is done blooming, I just cut the head off and done. But again, it's not very aggressive. It will seed itself. But again, if you have a green mulch layer, those seeds have a hard time getting down to the ground. And that green mulch tends to come up a little sooner, creating, darkness underneath. So the seed doesn't germinate. So that's just, little things to think about.
Excellent. Two more questions. Shelley says, since I had no painted lady butterflies this year, can I cut down my pearly everlasting?
Oh, sure. Yep. Go ahead. Absolutely. And that's another one. It definitely gets fuzzy and produces a lot of seed. I do the same thing. I cut the heads off. Yes. And as I mentioned, small yard, I learned, I figure out who can seed aggressively. And those are the ones that I tend to, as soon as they're done blooming, I cut them off.
All right, last question from Mary. She asks, are you still using glyphosate Roundup after the negative revelations, especially lymphoma, over the last several years?
I do. I still use it. I understand. The interesting thing about, again, if used properly, it is a tool. And I have my applicator's license. I use it properly. I mix it properly. I make sure it stays on site. So therefore, I do not spray if it's over a 5-mile-per-hour wind. And I look at that before I spray. I follow everything that is on the usage sheets so that I know I am using that product effectively and smart. With glyphosate, it hits, and I have to tackle my battle. I don't want, because it can take, if somebody wants a large area done, I can't typically lay out black plastic for over a year, unless it's goutweed, and then I do. But when glyphosate hits the plant absorbs it immediately. When it hits the ground, it breaks down very, very quickly into an inert product. And it does come, it is a conservation tool that is used to get rid of unwanted vegetation. But again, we follow the rules, we follow the mixing guidelines, we follow the proper spray technique. And, I just, I use it, and I use it properly.
So like Halloween candy. Everything's good in moderation. We've got one last question to keep an eye on time. Peg asked, we have an island on our lake that we want to use natives to help control erosion. We planted some plants, non-native, that the ducks, geese, and swans ate. Any suggestions? I've got one there, but probably not the right answer.
Actually, there is. So interestingly enough, if vegetation, on a lake, we all, everybody wants to mow right up to the edge of, right to the edge of the water. That's an invitation for geese and swans to come onto your property. If you create a sort of a vegetation fence, they won't. So on that island, get plant material that is relatively tall at the edge of the water. And and then you move it back up into the island. There are lots of sedges that love moisture, that do so well in moisture, and that's what they're designed to do. And also, sedges have great root systems to stop erosion. And that is such a great spot to put native plants in, because of those fibrous root systems. So sedges, you can get some taller sedges, and there's lots of species of sedges that are water loving. It will create that, it creates that fence. It creates because geese and swans don't want to crawl over that high vegetation because they don't know what's on the other side. There might be a fox, or what, there might be nothing, but they don't want that ambush. And we're doing this actually on campus at Michigan State along the Red Cedar River. We've stopped mowing areas up to the riverbank. We're letting it go natural. And we're actually slip seeding with native grass species so that it kind of, things get up about 3 feet. They won't go through it. So that's one means of stopping geese. Now, they're going to pick it out probably if you plant in the spring. So maybe plant later in the fall because geese will start to, they're going to start to migrate and move away. So if you establish those shorelines with native plants, and especially those sedges, they'll begin to grow more, and in the springtime they'll be much more established, and therefore they won't be easily plucked out.
Very good. That was the last of our questions, and we have rolled past our 11. Oh, I'm sorry. We have one more.
Joan Cooper, I have a verbal question. I've noticed I'm on a bird Facebook page, and people have noticed, I live out in Milford area, that in this area, the birds seem to have disappeared once it got hot. Did you notice that in Lansing? And what do you think is causing this problem this summer?
So birds are, especially our migrants, our warblers, especially the warblers, and a lot of songbirds are all migrants. So they're feeding profusely when they get here in the early spring during migration. They build their nests, they fledge, and probably about 2 months ago, things started to go back south. They moved south, and they might be more in the woods where there are many more insects for them to feed on. And I did notice, we didn't have many hummingbirds, but then I've seen other people who've had loads of hummingbirds. And I know now, I'm also a huge birder. A lot of the hummingbirds they're definitely south. They're almost gone. But yes, I did notice, but that's what the birds do. Once summer has hit, they're done raising their broods. They're gone. They tend to head south.
Thank you.
I think we're all going to be heading south soon if the weather keeps up like this. So that will wrap. Are you all finished? We're done with questions, I think.
Okay, can I keep going or?
Yeah.
Okay, good deal. I know. All right, so, again, I mentioned why should we plant? Because our insect populations are declining. And in Michigan, we have over 450 plus species of bees. Not just the honeybee, which is that's non-native. It was brought over, it's the European honeybee. And most of our bees are ground burrowers or they're cavity dwellers. As I mentioned, the coreopsis on the left, it blooms early in the summer, and mine is a huge attraction to these smaller bees because so many of them are so small. Nodding onion, they tend to start to bloom in the late summer. And this is actually a leafcutter bee that's on that nodding onion, trying to get as much little pollen. They just move around constantly. Other excellent plants, I have, the silphiums, which are the compass plant, and the coreopsis. So on the plant on the left is the compass plant, little green, small green sweat bees. The plant on the right is the sand coreopsis. That's called a longhorn bee. Check out the antenna on that baby. And these are all males, and they'll actually congregate together to stay warm if it's a chilly evening. But these are actually males, and they're just gathering pollen in they get aggressive with each other. So they're constantly butting heads, so to speak, until it's cold. And then they all gather together. The plant on the bottom, which is the pussy toes, Antonaria neglecta. So this is a leaf cutter bee on there. He is literally scraping off the fuzz on those, on that Antonaria plant. And it was so much fun to watch this. So he's gathering the fuzz to take back to their nest, I should say her nest. And also, one of the trees that I put in that I mentioned earlier was a musclewood tree, which is Carpinus caroliniana. They call it musclewood tree because when you look at the trunk, it looks like, if you were to flex a muscle, you see all those grooves of muscle. That's exactly what this tree looks like. It's exactly what the trunk looks like. And if somebody tries to cut it with a chainsaw, you can actually destroy your chainsaw because the wood is so dense. But the neat thing was this year that I really noticed, I noticed these little circular holes that were bitten out of the leaves. Leaf cutter bees they nibble a circular part. They nibble a circle out of the leaf. They roll it up in their mouth and they take it back to their nest and they pack it into either their in the ground, or they're in like a bee hotel that you can put up. And that's how they compartmentalize those little tubes, so that they put a leaf in, they put a bunch of, they either put an insect in there, say a larva of something that they've stung, and they bring in, they lay their egg on it, they bring another little leaf portion in, they pack it so that there's these little channels throughout that entire tube. But it's so cool to see all these little holes that have been nibbled out. Next, so what do our native bees also need? They need the bare ground. So even with putting a green mulch in, it doesn't completely cover every little space, so that there's areas for those bees to get in. Or you can leave actually a larger area of bare ground, a variety of plants, which means a variety of flower shapes, a water source. You can put in little dishes, put marbles in those dishes to give them something to land on, and fill it with water. Don't use herbicides or pesticides. As I mentioned, you can put up a bee hotel. Winter preparation means leaving some of the stems of, as an example, New England aster, the solidagos. They'll chew those little spots out, and that's where they'll make their little chambers. But if you have a bee hotel, that kind of helps to take the place. But I tend to leave most of the material up, down in the, I just let it flop down, and then in the spring, wait until it gets above, I believe it's above 70, because at that point, then they've all emerged, and then you can begin to clean up the garden, which is usually what I do. I try to, and if I want to clean it up early, I clean it up and I leave piles in the back so that I'm not composting all the bees that might be in those stems waiting to emerge. I simply put them in, I gather it into an area and I leave it there until we really get those 70-degree temps and above, and they have emerged. And also, butterflies need native plants. Life cycle of the monarch and milkweeds. They need milkweed for their developing larvae. I'm not sure if many of you have heard of black swallowwort. It is a very aggressive, invasive plant that we are trying desperately to control. Black swallowwort is in the same family as milkweeds. It exhibits the same, very similar characteristics. They're different different genera, but they're in the same family. If monarchs lay their eggs on black swallowwort, the larvae emerge from the egg, and not long after that, they die. And so it doesn't, we're losing, we already know we have declining monarch populations. So if you have moisture in your area, plant swamp milkweed. If you've got sunny, dry conditions, put in butterfly weed. You won't be disappointed. Now, if you have lots of common milkweed, here's my suggestion. In June, cut the plant in half. As long as there's leaves, cut above the leaf so that there'll be actually more little leaves that will come out from the axil of those, of the remaining leaves. And also cut some in July. Monarchs are looking for those tender leaves. If you have common milkweed and don't trim it back, they typically will not use it. It's too tough. And it's too tough for that new larvae that has emerged to chew through it. And also the alkaloids in the plant are at a premium. When there's fresh growth, the alkaloids are less toxic to that developing larvae. And so fresh leaves, that's what that female monarch is looking for. And the butterfly on the right is one of the hair streaks. The hair streak butterflies, they're not very big. They're about the size of, from the knuckle of my thumb to the tip of my thumb. That's how big they are. I think this is a common hair streak. I can't remember what its what its host plant is. But again, it visited my yard. It found my native plantings and was gathering nectar, as well as probably a little bit of pollen. It'll jump to another butterfly weed, and it'll pollinate that. Other species, that's a hoverfly on the left. Yes, it is a fly. It's not a bee, but it mimics a bee. And why? Because most things aren't going to want to go after a bee. So that's why it mimics. The beetle on the right is actually called a swamp milkweed bug. However, that's not swamp milkweed. That is actually butterfly weed. But again, it's fine. And it's, the milkweed is supporting habitat for other insects. Other important facts. Native populations are declining. Native pollinators are declining. Even if you can just remove a small area of turf grass and put in a native planting. You can plant in planters. Believe it or not, dill, fennel, and parsley are the host plant to swallowtail butterflies. I can remember I had a dill plant and I couldn't figure out why are all the leaves gone on this thing until I took a closer look, and there was a swallowtail. This swallowtail that's in the image on a zinnia. Zinnias are great for butterflies and bumblebees as well. I had bumblebees and other bees all over them every year. So you can put in annuals that supply nectar and honey. So that's a giant swallowtail, nativars. Classic example, there are so many coneflower colors out there, and also bee balm. There are so many cultivars of bee balm. If you want to put in some of these cultivars, try your hardest to keep the same flower color. That's important. Bees and butterflies tune into a specific color because that's what they're seeing. And if you put in white coneflowers, yes, things may find them, but it's harder for them to find that. Bee balm, now there is a red native bee balm, that's Monarda didyma. And bees and butterflies visit as well as hummingbirds, as well, because they like that red. This past summer, I actually did a research paper for one of my grad classes, and I did it on plants in the yard, natives versus cultivars of natives. Hands down, natives won with pollinator visitation. So just try to keep that in mind. If you want to plant native coneflower with a native R of coneflower, I'm okay with that. I'm not a purist, but try to keep the same color combinations. Helpful resources. So this is where we're going to get to that. Nurseries. Wild Type Nursery in Mason, Michigan is an excellent source of native plants. And Bill Snyder sources native seed for genotypes. He has so many different species of plants. And in addition, these past 2 years due to COVID, he had to schedule to visit. He had open days to the public. You had to sign up for a slot because normally the doors are wide open. Before COVID, he had, weekends that were set aside for, customer appreciation, shopping days. This year, it was definitely select. You had to fill out a time slot. And Hidden Savannah, which is down in the Kalamazoo area, he has a lot of specialty in Southwest Michigan flowers, native plants down there. Your conservation districts. There are so many conservation districts, and I would bet on the east side of the state, they have native plant sales, and they're probably they could very well be using either Wild Type or Designs by Nature, which I know he's got other nurseries now around the state, because otherwise he's in Langsburg. Wild One chapters. We have the Red Cedar Wild One here in the Lansing area. Look in the Wild Ones chapters in your area, most of them do native plant sales. I also know that there are other native plant nurseries that are popping up throughout the state that are really starting to get into it, which is wonderful because that was a limiting factor where do I get these plants? But those are excellent examples. Literature. I mentioned a field guide to natural communities of Michigan. I'm trying to remember, I can't remember what press it is, but if you Google it, you'll definitely find the book, Landscaping with Native Plants of Michigan by Lynn Steiner. She also has rain gardens. So that kind of helps you walk through a rain garden. Is it in the shade? Is it in the sunshine? She breaks down all the plant material, what does best and where. Other books by Heather Holm, who's one of my heroes, Pollinators of Native Plants. Wasps, this is a new book, Wasps, Their General Biology, Diversity, and Role as Beneficial Insects. I encourage you to try to get, if you look on her website, just Google her name. She's got a website. She'll talk about where she might be giving presentations. Especially now it's all Zoom, but chances are you can join that meeting. Excuse me, just 1 second. And the Xerces Society, which is a nationwide society, worldwide society that deals with butterflies. And they have excellent tips as well. And I think that is it.
All right. Well, that answers Marilyn and previous questions of where to buy native plants. Thank you very much. We have one last question from, oh, no, we have two. Jean asked, what is a good native tree to plant by itself in full sun?
Oh boy. Red maple. Believe it or not, actually red maple and white oak. So red maple, they bloom early in the spring. Sugar maple, red maple, silver maple. Red maple is fully pollinated by bees, nothing else. So that is great. Sugar maple, on the other hand, can either be wind pollinated or insect pollinated, but it really depends on how it comes out of its winter time. Whereas red maple, completely insect pollinated. Silver maple, wind pollinated. So doesn't do any good. So Red maple is wonderful, does excellent in the sunshine. White oak. Oak species are known, oh, I wish I could remember the number. But Doug Tallamy, who's also a hero of mine, I encourage you to read, what is it, Bring Nature Home. And he also has another book called Oaks. I highly encourage every one of you to especially read Bringing Nature Home. It's an inspiration. But oak trees are known to be a food source and host plant for over 500 species of insects. It's the perfect tree to put in and does so well in full sun.
All righty, that's the last of our questions that are on here. Lots of thank yous, excellent presentations, a lot of fantastic information. President Margaret or Kathy, do you have anything else that you all would like to add as we wrap up our educational series today? Would anybody like to turn on their video? We can do that now, I think, safely. Becky just said, thank you so much for all the great information.
And I agree. Thank you very much. I'm definitely going to need to go back and watch the video again for my. Definitely going to need to go back and watch the video again for my. So thank you, Carolyn.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Oh, thank you, Carolyn.
Oh, you're so welcome. I really wish we could have been in person, and it's so much more fun. I really wish we could have been in person, and it's so much more fun. I'm glad I could get the word out.
When you're allowed to video, then
I'm
you
glad I
see
could get the
everybody's,
word out. Right.
pictures.
Right.
We're getting a little
Amazing.
feedback. Our next presentation will be in October. Don Reif will be
Our
on
next
also talking about
presentation
more
will be
than
in
monarch.
October. Don Reif will be on also talking about more than monarch.
And we'll also have today's presentation up on YouTube
And we'll
for
also
everybody
have
so that we
today's
can
presentation up on
review it
YouTube
again.
for everybody so that we can.
I have all of my notes that I've been scribbling down at the same time.
I have all of my notes that I've been scribbling down at the same time.
Margaret, I will turn it over to you to wrap things up.
Margaret, I will turn it over to you to wrap things up.
That's just because she doesn't want to echo anymore. That's just because she doesn't want to echo anymore. I guess she's. Well, thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you in the gardens next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Well, that was pretty good.
Yeah.